let's get ready to read chapter 4 of Engaging with God, a Biblical Theology of Worship by David Peterson. Chapter 4 is called Jesus and the New Covenant. And in the last chapter, we saw how Jesus fulfills everything that the temple was all about. And if that's the case, then he's going to start to point us toward a new way of engaging with God, a new way of knowing God, and that means a new covenant. Now, the chapter is going to talk about Jesus as a worshiper and how Jesus really fulfilled the ideal picture of worship toward God. As a Jewish worshiper, his prayer, his fulfillment of the Old Testament ritual system, and his obedience to God in every way. And yet, even though he fulfills it perfectly, he still in his teachings and his action hints at really a whole new way of worship that will supersede the old. Now, we see that in his interaction with the law of Moses. Jesus never really challenged the law, and he fulfilled the law in every way. And yet, when he interacts with the Pharisees about the traditions that the Pharisees had added to the law, some of the things he says about their traditions cut pretty strongly maybe against the law as it was practiced in those times, and point us to a different, maybe a changing role of the law in light of the coming of Jesus. And there's two particular aspects you'll look at. One is how Jesus interacts with the ritual purity and defilement system of the law and of the Pharisees, and also how he interacts with the Sabbath. So you're going to want to look at what he says that starts to question the continuing role of the law in those areas. Now, throughout all of the Gospels, Jesus is seen consistently as the answer to the problem of sin. He's going to be a part of the salvation provision that God makes. But it's only later, as you move through the Gospels, that it becomes more and more clear that his death is really tied up in salvation. That becomes clear in the passage where Jesus calls himself a ransom, where he gives up his life as a ransom. And there's some numerous things in that passage that connect to Old Testament themes to bring them into fulfillment. But the role of Jesus' death really becomes clear in the Last Supper. And the Last Supper was Jesus gathered his disciples together the night before he went to the cross. It was actually the time of the Passover. So really pay attention to how the Last Supper fulfills the Passover and how Jesus came to see himself as really the fulfillment of all of God's promises inherent in the Passover. But beyond that, as Jesus took the elements of the Passover meal and he shared them with his disciples, he started to talk about those elements in terms of covenant. And you see that he's initiating a new covenant through his death on the cross that supersedes the Mosaic covenant. And really, at this point, it's really important to go back and read and understand Jeremiah chapter 31. Now, when I'm reading these chapters, I don't look up all the verses. You might do that, but you probably don't. But I'd really encourage you to go back and look up Jeremiah chapter 31, especially around verses 31 through 34, when he refers to that. So you really have a grasp of this new covenant idea that was prophesied in the past, because Jesus seems to have that in mind when he talks about his own death implementing a new covenant with God. And also it'd be helpful to go back and look at Matthew 26, around verses 27 and 28, where Jesus initiates this new thing. And at the same time, he takes those elements of the Passover meal and he inaugurates this new memorial type of meal. He makes them into a remembrance of him, that whenever they have a meal together, the breaking of bread and the sharing of the wine is to remind them of what Jesus has done for them and to look forward to his fulfillment of all of God's promises in the future. And so the author asks, does Jesus initiate a new cult? In other words, does he take this memorial meal and create a new ritual setting that supersedes the Old Testament ritual setting? And so that's something that you really want to grapple with and ask yourself as you read through his treatment of that, because that informs how we practice the Lord's Supper or communion in our own churches. And if you're a worship leader, then you're asking those questions. What do we do with this memorial meal? How do we practice it? What are the guidelines that help us understand its role in the life of the church? Now, finally, I just want to encourage you as you read this to read it again, like last chapter, with a sense of really being inspired by Jesus. As we see how amazing Jesus is and all that he's done for us, I think you should and probably will be just really encouraged and inspired in your own worship as you interact with Jesus and the new covenant. God bless you as you read.